The light was supposed to guide them home, but instead, it lured them to their deaths. Have you ever wondered what secrets are buried beneath the crashing waves and isolated cliffs where lighthouses stand? These towering beacons were meant to keep sailors safe, yet some have become silent witnesses to unspeakable horrors, murders so gruesome, so terrifying, that even the ocean itself refuses to wash away their stains. Tonight, we unravel 5 horrifying tales of lighthouse murders, stories of madness, betrayal, and supernatural forces lurking in the shadows of the sea. From keepers who vanished without a trace to blood-soaked lantern rooms where screams were swallowed by the wind, these are not just stories, they are warnings. Stay with me until the end if you dare, but be warned, once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a lighthouse the same way again. And before you descend into the darkness, subscribe, because some stories are too terrifying to be forgotten. The sea remembers every scream, every secret swallowed by its waves, and I, unfortunately, remember too. It was a job I never wanted, a duty thrust upon me by circumstance more than choice. The lighthouse keeper they called me, though in truth, I was more of a prisoner than a guardian. The grey stone tower was my world, the churning ocean my only companion, and Nathan, my fellow keeper, the bane of my existence. We were oil and water, fire and ice, 2 souls trapped in a metal and stone cage with nothing but resentment to fuel the long, monotonous days. He was a gruff, silent type, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. I, on the other hand, was, well, let's just say I preferred a bit of conversation, a bit of human connection in this desolate place. Our shifts were staggered, thankfully, but even the briefest encounters were enough to send my blood pressure soaring. A curt nod in the morning, a mumbled exchange about the lamp's upkeep. That was the extent of our interaction. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Then came the storm, a tempest of biblical proportions that descended upon us with the fury of a scorned god. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the lighthouse walls, and the waves crashed against the rocks below, threatening to swallow us whole. We battened down the hatches, secured everything we could, and waited for it to pass, each of us huddled in our respective quarters, praying for dawn. That night, the storm took Nathan. I found him the next morning, sprawled out on the narrow walkway outside the lamp room, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The wind must have caught him, thrown him against the railing. It was a grim sight, a stark reminder of the raw power of nature and the fragility of human life. But honestly, my first thought wasn't grief, it was panic. The storm was still raging, making it impossible to signal for help, impossible to even open the heavy lighthouse door. I was trapped, alone with a corpse, on a tiny island, in the middle of a raging sea. The official procedures, the regulations, the protocols, all flashed through my mind, but none of them offered a solution to my immediate problem. I could not report his death, could not leave the lighthouse unmanned. So, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I couldn't let the body decompose in the lamp room, not with the storm still trapping me there. I would lash him to the railing. Outside, the cold sea air would slow the decay, keep him manageable, until I could finally signal for help. It was a morbid task, wrapping ropes around his lifeless limbs, securing him to the metal railing that encircled the lamp room. His skin was already cold to the touch, his eyes staring blankly at the churning sky. I tried not to look at his face, tried not to think about the man he once was, the man I never liked. The first night, after Nathan's death, was the worst. The storm hadn't abated, the wind still howled like a tormented spirit, and the lighthouse creaked and groaned under its relentless assault. But amidst the chaos, I began to notice something unsettling, a subtle shift in the wind, a slight change in the rhythm of the waves. It was as if the storm itself was watching me. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw Nathan's body swaying in the wind, a macabre pendulum marking the passage of time. And then I saw it, or at least I thought I saw it. A slight movement, a subtle tilt of his head, as if he were looking directly at me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nothing, just the lifeless corpse swaying in the wind. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The seed of fear had begun to sprout. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, horribly wrong. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. The storm finally began to subside, but the unsettling feeling remained, growing stronger with each passing hour. I avoided looking at Nathan's body, but I could feel its presence, a cold, dead weight hanging in the air. And then, the whispers started, faint, almost imperceptible sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, I dismissed them as the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. But as the days passed, they became more distinct, more deliberate. Whispers that seemed to call my name, whispers that seemed to emanate from outside. One evening, as dusk began to fall, I was checking the lamp, making sure it was burning brightly against the gathering darkness. As I adjusted the lens, I caught a glimpse of Nathan's body in the periphery of my vision. And this time, there was no mistaking it. His head was turned, his eyes were fixed on me, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile was playing on his lips. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in the beam of the lamp, like a moth caught in a spiderweb. I stumbled back, away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I retreated to my quarters, barricading the door with whatever furniture I could find. I huddled in the corner, shivering with fear, listening to the wind and the waves, listening for the whispers. And then I heard it, a distinct, unmistakable sound, a knocking on the window. I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes wide with terror. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the lamp room, from outside. But then, a thought, colder and more terrifying than the wind itself, pierced through my fear. If Nathan's body was outside, lashed to the railing, then who was knocking on the window? I forced myself to breathe, to think, to try and make sense of the impossible. It had to be the wind, I told myself, the wind rattling the glass. But the knocking continued, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping that defied all logical explanation. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to see. I grabbed the lantern, my hand shaking so violently that I almost dropped it, and slowly, cautiously, made my way to the lamp room. The air in the lamp room was thick with a cold, heavy presence, a palpable sense of dread that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was even more terrifying. I raised the lantern, its flickering light casting long, distorted shadows across the room, and slowly approached the window. And then I saw it, Nathan. But it wasn't the Nathan I had lashed to the railing. This Nathan was different. His skin was pale and clammy, his eyes were wide and vacant, and his lips were stretched into a grotesque mocking grin. He was inside the lamp room, inside the lighthouse. How? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. He raised his hand, his fingers gnarled and twisted, and pressed it against the glass. His knuckles were white, his nails were long and sharp, and his eyes were filled with an unholy light. He was looking directly at me, his gaze piercing through my soul. And then he spoke. His voice was a raspy, guttural whisper, a sound that seemed to claw its way out of the depths of hell. "Let me in," he croaked, his breath fogging the glass. "It's cold out here." I screamed, a primal, animalistic sound that echoed through the lighthouse, and stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could, away from the window, away from Nathan, away from the horror that had taken hold of the lighthouse. I didn't stop running until I reached the bottom of the tower, until I was standing in the narrow entrance hall, gasping for breath. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, bolted it, and wedged a chair underneath the handle. I knew it wouldn't hold him for long, but it was all I could do. I huddled in the corner, listening to the wind and the waves, listening for the sound of Nathan's footsteps. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate dragging sound, coming from above. He was climbing the stairs. I closed my eyes and prayed to whatever gods might be listening, prayed for a miracle, prayed for dawn. The dragging sound grew closer, closer, with each passing moment. I knew it was only a matter of time before he reached me. But then, a new sound filled the air, a distant, rhythmic thumping coming from the sea. A helicopter, rescue. The sound grew louder, closer, and a beam of light pierced through the darkness, illuminating the lighthouse. I stumbled to my feet, threw open the door, and ran outside, waving my arms frantically. The helicopter landed on the small helipad nearby, and two figures emerged, their faces etched with concern. I babbled incoherently, trying to explain what had happened, trying to tell them about Nathan, about the knocking, about the horror that lurked within the lighthouse. They looked at me with pity, their eyes filled with disbelief. They searched the lighthouse, top to bottom, but found nothing. No sign of Nathan's body, no sign of any disturbance. Just me, alone in the lighthouse, raving like a madman. They took me away, back to the mainland, back to civilization. They told me it was the storm, the isolation, the grief that had driven me to the brink of madness. They told me I had imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And I know that Nathan is still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to let him in. The sea remembers every scream, every secret swallowed by its waves. And I will never forget the night Nathan came knocking. Even now, years later, I still hear the whispers, still see the grotesque smile in my dreams. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that one day he will come for me. One day, he will finally get his revenge, and there will be no escape. I never believed in ghosts, not until I took the job at Black Rock Lighthouse. The locals warned me about it, of course. They always do in these small coastal towns, where superstition runs as deep as the ocean itself. I would laugh when they told me about old Thomas Wilcox, the keeper who allegedly lured a merchant vessel to its doom back in 1897, all for the sake of plundering its cargo. They said he manipulated the light on a stormy night, guiding the ship straight into the jagged rocks instead of safely to harbor. 27 souls lost to the hungry sea. Wilcox was never formally charged, but everyone knew. 3 months after the incident, they found him hanging in the lantern room, his body swaying gently above the great light he had once tended. Just stories to scare tourists, I thought. Ghost tales to keep kids away from the dangerous cliffs. That was before I spent my first night alone in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, before the whispers began, before I started waking up with the taste of salt water in my mouth. The isolation hit me first. The lighthouse stands on a narrow spit of rock about half a mile from shore, connected to the mainland by a stone causeway that disappears completely during high tide. 6 hours cut off from the world, twice a day. No problem for me, I told myself. I would enjoy the solitude, the simplicity of the keeper's life. Just me, the rotating beam of light, and the endless symphony of waves against rock. The keeper's quarters were small but comfortable enough. A round stone building attached to the base of the tower. Everything was clean, if a bit outdated, smelling faintly of brine and old wood. Old Thomas Wilcox stared at me from a faded photograph hanging in the small office, his eyes severe beneath a heavy brow, his beard white against the dark uniform. I remember feeling a slight chill when I first saw his image, but I dismissed it. Just the damp air getting to me, nothing more. My first week passed without incident. I settled into a routine, maintaining the light, keeping logs, monitoring weather conditions, and radioing reports to the Coast Guard station 15 miles down the shore. The work was easy, almost meditative. I enjoyed my solitary walks around the small island, watching seabirds wheel overhead and seals playing in the foaming water below. When darkness fell, I would sit in my small living quarters with a book or listen to music, letting the steady rhythm of the rotating light above lull me into a peaceful state. The locals must have exaggerated the whole haunted lighthouse thing, I thought. Probably just trying to make their sleepy little town seem more interesting to outsiders. I should have known better. It began with small things. Items moved from where I had left them. The faint sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase when I knew I was alone. Cold spots in corridors that should have been uniformly heated. I rationalized each occurrence. Old buildings settle and creak. The wind plays tricks in the cylindrical tower. My memory was faulty, that was all. But then came the night of the first storm, a violent nor'easter that slammed into the coast with unexpected fury. Waves crashed against the base of the lighthouse with such force that spray reached the lantern room, over 100 feet above the water. The wind howled through every crack and crevice, creating an eerie, mournful wailing that set my teeth on edge. I checked and rechecked the light, making sure it remained operational, guiding any ships away from the treacherous coastline. That was when I heard it for the first time, a voice barely audible beneath the roaring of the storm. "They are coming back for you." I spun around, certain someone else was in the lantern room with me, but there was only darkness beyond the glow of the great lens. My heart hammered in my chest as I searched every corner, finding nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks. But as I descended the spiral staircase back to my quarters, I could not shake the feeling of being followed, of eyes watching me from the shadows. That night, I dreamed of drowning, of being trapped in the dark waters as a ship broke apart around me. I struggled toward a distant light, my lungs burning, my limbs growing heavier with each desperate stroke. The light grew closer, revealing itself as the beam from the lighthouse. But something was wrong. The light was moving, deliberately leading me toward the rocks, instead of away from them. I saw a figure in the lantern room, manipulating the light, and though I could not make out his features, I knew it was Thomas Wilcox, laughing as he condemned me to the depths. I woke up gasping, choking, the taste of salt water strong in my mouth. My bed was bone dry, but the scent of the sea, of salt and decay, was overwhelming in the small room. Morning brought rationality with it. Just a nightmare triggered by the storm and the ghost stories, I reasoned. Nothing more than my subconscious playing tricks on me. I went about my duties with determined normalcy, refusing to give in to irrational fears. But that night, as I climbed the steps to perform the evening check on the light, I found wet footprints leading up the stairs ahead of me. Not my own. These were larger, made by heavy boots, and they glistened with seawater. They led all the way to the lantern room, where they stopped abruptly before the great lens. No one could have entered the lighthouse without my knowledge. The only boat was mine, secured at the small dock below. The causeway was currently submerged beneath the high tide. I was utterly alone on this small rock in the sea, or at least, I should have been. The photograph of Thomas Wilcox had changed. I noticed it the next morning as I entered the office to record the weather observations in the log. His eyes, previously staring straight ahead, now seemed to be looking directly at me, following me as I moved across the room. His thin lips, previously set in a grim line, now curved upward in the slightest suggestion of a smile. I took the photograph down, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but I could not bring myself to hang it again. Instead, I placed it face down in a drawer and slammed it shut. That night, I found it back on the wall, and now Wilcox was definitely smiling, a knowing, malevolent grin that sent ice through my veins. The whispers grew more frequent after that, coming not just during storms but in the dead of calm as well. Sometimes just incomprehensible murmuring, sometimes clear phrases that chilled me to the bone. They know what you did. The sea never forgets. They are coming for you. I began to dread the nights, fighting sleep as long as possible, knowing that the dreams of drowning would come again. And they did, each more vivid than the last. Sometimes I was one of the passengers, sometimes a crew member, but always the lighthouse led us to our doom. Always Wilcox was there, manipulating the light with cruel purpose. Always I woke choking on phantom seawater, the smell of decay heavy in my nostrils. I started researching the incident, digging through old records in the Lighthouse library and online during my supply runs to the mainland. The ship was called the Merry Bride, a merchant vessel returning from the East Indies with a valuable cargo of spices, silks, and other exotic goods. Reports suggested that Wilcox had fallen on hard times, gambling debts mounting, his position at the lighthouse his last chance at respectability. Some speculated that he had arranged with local smugglers to share in the plunder of the ship in exchange for guiding it to its doom. No bodies were ever recovered. All hands lost to the hungry sea. In the weeks before his suicide, locals reported that Wilcox had become increasingly erratic, claiming to hear voices, see apparitions of dripping wet sailors watching him from the rocks below. They said he complained of waking up choking on seawater, just like me. Last night was the breaking point. A fierce storm had blown in, much like the one on the night the Merry Bride was lost. I was in the lantern room, making sure the light remained true, when the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face, and frost began to form on the inside of the glass. The light flickered, though there was no mechanical reason for it to do so, and then I saw him, Thomas Wilcox, standing on the other side of the lens. Not a solid figure, but not quite transparent either, his uniform dripping with seawater. His face bloated and pale, eyes sunken, yet burning with a terrible light. "They are here," he said, his voice somehow carrying over the howl of the wind. "They have been waiting for someone to take my place." I backed away as he reached toward the controls of the light, his hand passing through solid metal to adjust the beam. Through the windows, I could see a ship in the distance, struggling in the heavy seas. The light from the lens swung away from the safe channel, beginning to guide the vessel toward the rocks. "No," I screamed, lunging for the controls, but invisible hands gripped my arms, holding me back. Around me, the air filled with the presence of others, sailors in rotting, antiquated clothes, their flesh hanging from bones too long immersed in the sea. The crew of the Merry Bride, come to claim another soul for their ghostly company. I am writing this now, as dawn breaks. The storm has passed, and with it, the apparitions. The ship I saw managed to correct its course, guided by modern GPS rather than relying solely on the lighthouse beam. It sits now in the harbor, safe and sound, but I know they will return with the next storm. I know now that Thomas Wilcox did not commit suicide. The crew of the Merry Bride claimed him, made him pay for his treachery, and now they want me to take his place, to become the new Phantom Keeper, luring ships to their doom for all eternity. I am leaving today, as soon as my replacement arrives. I have already radioed in my resignation, citing health reasons. They were understanding, even sympathetic. Apparently, few keepers last more than a few months at Blackrock Lighthouse. I wonder how many others have experienced what I have. How many others have fled before the vengeful spirits could claim them? I will never know, because I am never coming back to this place. But somehow, as I pack my meager belongings, I cannot shake the feeling that it may already be too late, that a part of me will remain here forever, bound to the light and to the restless souls who guard this treacherous coast. The taste of salt water lingers on my tongue, and when I look in the mirror, just for a moment, I see Thomas Wilcox looking back at me, his eyes knowing, his smile growing wider as the light continues its endless rotation above us both. I was always drawn to lighthouses, those solitary sentinels standing guard against the sea. Something about their isolation called to me, like they held secrets only the brave could discover. That's why I jumped at the chance when the Historical Society asked me to document the abandoned Blackrock Lighthouse for their archives. They told me it had been empty since 1973, when the 3 keepers vanished without explanation. The lighthouse had been locked from the inside, they said, with no signs of struggle or escape. Just 3 empty beds and a half-finished meal on the table. No bodies were ever found, just the logbook, filled with increasingly disturbing entries that ended abruptly. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs, the way the locals averted their eyes when I mentioned where I was headed, how the boat captain refused to stay even a single night on the island. But I was too excited by the mystery, too confident in rational explanations. The journey to the island was rough, waves crashing against our small boat. As dark clouds gathered overhead, the captain kept looking nervously at the approaching storm, muttering something about the lighthouse having moods, as if it were alive. I laughed it off as superstition, the kind of stories sailors have told for centuries. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its white tower stark against the black rocks that gave the place its name. The windows were dark, dead eyes staring out to sea. The captain unloaded my supplies quickly, promising to return in 1 week, weather permitting. As his boat disappeared into the mist, I felt the first real twinge of unease, a cold finger tracing my spine. I was truly alone now. The heavy iron key the Historical Society provided turned with surprising ease in the lock, as if the lighthouse had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was stale, but not unpleasant, carrying the scent of old books and lamp oil, rather than the decay I had half expected. Everything was exactly as the reports had described, the rooms preserved like a museum exhibit of the keeper's final day. I set up my equipment in the living quarters, unpacked my supplies, and began to explore. The first 2 days were uneventful, just the methodical work of photographing, measuring, and documenting. I found the famous logbook in the watchroom, carefully preserved in a waterproof case. The initial entries were mundane, detailing weather conditions, supply levels, and maintenance tasks. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone gradually shifted. Chief Keeper Thomas wrote of hearing footsteps on the spiral staircase when his 2 assistants were asleep. Assistant Morrison complained of shadows that moved against the wind. Young Calloway, the newest keeper, described dreams of drowning men calling his name. I told myself these were just the natural results of isolation, the mind playing tricks after weeks of confinement with the same 2 companions, the constant moan of the wind, and the relentless rhythm of the waves. On the 3rd night, the storm that had been threatening finally arrived, lashing the lighthouse with rain and wind that howled like a living thing in pain. I sat in the watchroom, transcribing the logbook entries by lantern light, as the electricity had gone out hours before. That's when I first noticed something odd about my reflection in the brass lamp. It seemed to move a fraction of a second after I did, like an echo rather than a mirror image. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. I went outside to check for damage and found a large piece of driftwood had washed up on the rocky shore. It was weathered and smooth, shaped almost like a human figure. I couldn't explain the impulse that made me drag it back to the lighthouse and prop it in the corner of the living quarters. It just felt right somehow, like bringing in a guest who had been waiting too long in the rain. That night, I continued with the logbook. The entries grew increasingly disturbed as I approached the final days. The chief wrote about something knocking from inside the walls, rhythmic taps that matched no Morse code he knew. Morrison described seeing a man standing outside the lantern room window, 100 feet above the crashing waves. Impossible, of course. Calloway's last entry simply stated, "I know what happened to the ship now. They never left. They're still here, in the rocks, in the walls, in the water, and they're hungry." The final entry, written in a shaky hand that matched none of the keepers, read only, "He is here." After that, nothing. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I jerked awake to the sound of tapping, soft but insistent, coming from the wall behind me. Tap, 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 then silence. Tap, 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 like someone trying to get my attention. The next day, I found wet footprints leading from the entrance up the spiral staircase, though I was certain I hadn't gone outside since the previous morning. They ended abruptly halfway up, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I followed them to their endpoint and found a small puddle of seawater, but not regular seawater. It was darker, almost black, and when I tentatively touched it with my finger, it felt warm and slightly sticky. I washed my hands thoroughly afterward, but the smell lingered, briny and organic, like rotting seaweed. That night, as I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind moan around the tower, I heard something new, a sound like soft singing coming from the lantern room far above me. A sailor's chanty, I thought, though I couldn't make out the words, just the mournful tune, rising and falling with the wind. I told myself it was just the acoustics of the lighthouse playing tricks, the wind finding just the right angle to whistle through some crack or opening. But deep down, I knew better. Something was calling to me, trying to lure me upstairs. I woke before dawn to find the driftwood figure had moved. I was absolutely certain I had left it in the corner, but now it stood next to my bed, leaning slightly as if peering down at my sleeping form. Its weathered surface seemed more detailed somehow, with knots and whorls that suggested eyes, a mouth frozen in a silent scream. I told myself I must have moved it in my sleep, some bizarre bout of sleepwalking brought on by stress and isolation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had moved itself, that it was watching me. Later that day, I found an old photograph tucked between the pages of the logbook, one I had somehow missed before. It showed 3 men standing proudly in front of the lighthouse, their faces serious beneath their caps. But something about the image disturbed me deeply. Behind them, barely visible in one of the tower windows, was another face, blurry and indistinct, but undeniably there, watching. I flipped the photo over and found a note in faded ink. 3 keepers, and the one who keeps them. The date was 1887, nearly 100 years before the disappearance I was investigating. As I stared at the image, a chill ran through me. The face in the window looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. That night, the 6th of my stay, I dreamed of drowning. Cold, black water filled my lungs as I sank deeper, past any hope of surface or air. But I wasn't afraid. There was a strange comfort in the descent, a sense of belonging in the crushing depths. Voices called to me from below, promising secrets, knowledge, company in my solitude. I woke gasping, my sleeping bag soaked with seawater, though all the windows were closed and locked. The driftwood figure now stood at the foot of my bed, and in the dim light, I could have sworn it had moved slightly, one twisted arm extended toward me in silent invitation. I backed away, heart pounding, and fled upstairs to the watchroom. The logbook lay open, though I was certain I had closed it before sleeping. A new entry had appeared on the previously blank page after the final keeper's note. In handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own, it read, "I understand now. The lighthouse doesn't keep the ships safe from the rocks. It keeps the thing in the rocks contained. But it's failing. The walls are too thin now. He's getting through." On the final morning, my last day before the boat was scheduled to return, I woke to find my reflection in the small shaving mirror had changed. My face looked gaunt, eyes sunken, skin pale with a faintly greenish tinge. But worse than that was the expression, a knowing smirk that I wasn't consciously making. As I stared, horrified, my reflection's lips moved independently of my own, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Join us," it was saying. "We've been so lonely." I stumbled backward, knocking the mirror to the floor where it shattered into countless gleaming shards. Each piece reflected a different face, none of them mine. I ran to the living quarters to find the driftwood figure gone, though the door remained locked from the inside. In its place was a small puddle of black seawater, and next to it, a wet trail leading to the wall where a previously invisible door now stood, slightly ajar. A door that, according to the lighthouse plans, should not exist. Beyond it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. The steps, slick with moisture. The smell that rose from below was ancient and salt-laden, the breath of something that had waited centuries in the deep. I should have run, should have barricaded myself in until the boat arrived. Instead, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I found myself reaching for the lantern, lighting its wick with trembling hands, and starting down the hidden steps. They spiraled down far below sea level, into the heart of the rock itself. The walls wept moisture, black droplets that fell upward against gravity. At the bottom, I found a chamber carved from the living rock, its walls lined with alcoves. In each alcove stood a figure, not statues but something else, something that had once been human. Sailors, I realized, from ships that had crashed against the rocks over centuries. Their skin had the texture of driftwood, their eyes replaced by gleaming shells, their mouths permanently open in silent screams or ecstasy. I couldn't tell which. And among them, 3 figures I recognized from the photograph, still wearing the tattered remains of their keepers' uniforms. I understood then what the logbook meant. The keepers hadn't vanished. They had joined those they were meant to protect others from, become part of the collection of the thing that lived in the rock beneath the lighthouse. As this realization struck me, the lantern flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness. But I wasn't alone. Something moved in the dark, something vast and patient that had been waiting a very long time. I felt cold, wet tendrils brush against my face, gentle as a lover's caress. A voice that was not a voice spoke directly into my mind. "You found my logbook," it said. "You read my invitation. Welcome home, new keeper." The boat found the lighthouse empty the next day, locked from the inside, with no sign of struggle. Just my half-finished notes, my equipment, and a new entry in the old logbook, written in my hand. The lighthouse must always have a keeper. That was 5 years ago. I'm still here, you see, though not as I was. The thing in the rock has changed me, shown me wonders and horrors beyond human understanding. I've learned to manipulate the lighthouse, to call the ships when it hungers, to use the light not as a warning, but as a lure. Sometimes, in the brass fixtures or the windows on stormy nights, I catch glimpses of my reflection. It whispers to me, begging for release, for an end. But it's too late for that now. I have become the keeper and the kept. And sometimes, when the night is darkest and the storm is high, I write in my logbook, hoping someone like you will find it, Read it. Come to me. We're so lonely here, you see. We need new company. Listen carefully. Can you hear the tapping in your walls? Can you see the shadow outside your window? Look closely at your reflection. Is it truly yours? Or is it mine? Reaching out across time and space, inviting you home. He is here, and soon, very soon, you will be too. When I first arrived at the lighthouse, the silence felt like a comfort. The salty air, the rhythmic crashing of waves against the jagged rocks, and the vast open sea stretching into the horizon was the solitude I had longed for. The lighthouse had stood abandoned for decades, ever since the last keeper vanished, without a trace. Some of the mainlanders whispered about hauntings, strange noises carried on the wind, and shadows moving where none should be, but I paid no mind to their superstitions. I was a man of reason. I had spent my life tending to lighthouses, and I had never encountered anything beyond the ordinary isolation of my work. This place would be no different. My first few days were peaceful. The machinery was old, but functional, and with a bit of oil and elbow grease. I had the beacon burning bright again. Nights were spent reading by lantern light, listening to the wind howl outside. The only unsettling thing was the basement, damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. It felt different from the rest of the structure, almost as if it did not belong. The air was colder there, thick, stagnant. I chalked it up to years of neglect and tried not to think about it too much. Then, on my fourth day, I found the door. It was in the basement, tucked behind a leaning shelf covered in dust. The wood was unlike the rest of the lighthouse, older, darker, swollen with moisture. Mold bloomed along its edges, pulsing with an awful, putrid smell. It was an unnatural addition, something wedged into the structure long after the lighthouse had been built. The handle was rusted, but when I reached for it, the metal was strangely warm against my palm, as if something had just been holding it. I pulled, but the door would not budge. Something on the other side resisted, as if the air itself was pressing against it, pushing back. A gust of wind howled through the basement, rattling the walls, making the beams groan. I shivered, backing away. It was just an old door, probably a storage room or some forgotten construction. Still, an unease settled in my chest, heavy and unwelcome. I decided to leave it alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, rising up through the wooden floorboards. Knocking. I sat up, heart hammering. The wind outside was strong, the waves loud, but the knocking was distinct. A slow, deliberate rap, rap, rap. I forced myself to breathe. Old wood settling, I told myself. The structure shifting in the wind. Yet as the minutes passed, the sound did not fade. It continued, steady, patient. The next morning, I went to the basement with a hammer and nails. Whatever was behind that doorwind, shifting foundation, or something else, I was not going to let it keep me awake. I secured the door shut, hammering each nail deep into the damp wood, sealing it tight. The knocking stopped. For one night, the next morning, I found the nails scattered on the floor. The door stood slightly ajar. A sharp chill ran through me. I had driven those nails in myself, had felt the resistance of the wood beneath each strike. There was no way they could have loosened on their own, and yet they lay in neat little piles at my feet, as if deliberately placed. I forced the door shut again, pressing my weight against it. This time I used more nails, reinforcing the wood with planks from an old crate I had found outside. As I worked, the silence in the basement felt suffocating, as though the very air was watching me. I ignored the feeling and left, refusing to give in to the creeping dread in my gut. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, rap, rap, rap. It was insistent, almost angry. I buried my head under the covers, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. I refused to acknowledge it. If I did not acknowledge it, it was not real. But then the whispering began. Low voices, guttural, pressing against my ears. I could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable pleading, desperate. A chorus of voices begging for something I did not understand. I barely slept. When the sun finally rose, I felt like a man unraveling. My hands trembled as I made my morning coffee. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. It was the wind. The wind through the cracks, I told myself. My exhaustion playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I repeated it, I did not believe it. By the sixth night, the door had begun to rot. The once sturdy wood was now soft, sagging. The nails I had driven in had rusted over, their heads eaten away, as if something had been gnawing at them. A damp smell filled the air, thick and heavy, like salt water and decay. My stomach churned. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Then the water came. I woke up to the sound of dripping. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but as I swung my legs over the bed, my feet hit water. The floor was soaked. A slow, creeping flood had spread across the room, dark and stagnant. I grabbed my lantern and followed the trail, heart hammering as I realized it led to the basement. With shaking hands, I opened the door at the top of the stairs and shined my light downward. The water was seeping from under the old door, and then I saw them. Pressed against the inside of the wood were hands, pale, swollen hands with bloated fingers splayed against the damp surface, as though something inside was pushing to get out. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get off this cursed island, to never look back. But my feet were frozen in place. The hands shifted, pressing harder. The whispers turned to wails. The knocking turned to pounding. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The basement was silent again. The water still. The air thick, with something unseen, something waiting. I did not move for a long time. My body trembled with an unfamiliar terror, my mind struggling to grasp what I had seen. And then, slowly, I forced myself to turn away, to climb the stairs, to lock myself in my room and wait for daylight. I knew now that I was not alone, and whatever was behind that door was getting stronger. I had to end this. Tomorrow, I would take an axe and finish it for good. The next morning, the island was eerily still. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the wind barely stirred the sea. I had barely slept. My hands shook as I gripped the axe, my knuckles white with tension. I made my way to the basement, each step heavier than the last, my breath shallow and ragged. I had convinced myself that if I destroyed the door, if I shattered whatever lay beyond it, this nightmare would end. The whispers had grown bolder overnight, voices curling around my ears, even through the wooden floorboards. My name had been spoken among them. When I reached the basement, I hesitated. The door was worse than before. The wood was no longer just rotting. It was sagging, pulsing like something alive. Dark water seeped from beneath it, reeking of salt and decay. The air was thick, humid, pressing against me like unseen hands. The whispers stopped the moment my boots splashed into the rising water. I lifted the axe. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. With all my strength I swung, the blade buried deep into the wood with a sickening squelch, like cutting into flesh. A wet gasp echoed from the other side, a sound too human, too wrong. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to keep going. Another swing. The wood cracked, splitting open like a wound. The water surged forward, spilling over my boots, swallowing the floor, and then the door collapsed. Darkness, black water rushed over me, pulling me under with an unnatural force. My limbs flailed, my lungs burned as I fought against the impossible depth. It was not just water, it was something else, something vast and hungry. Shapes moved in the blackness, shifting, writhing. Faces emerged, bloated and disfigured, their mouths open in silent screams. And then I saw them, the keepers, their uniforms tattered, their flesh waterlogged, their eyes empty voids. They surrounded me, floating weightless in the abyss, their fingers reaching, grasping. My breath left me in a choked scream as one of them turned. His face was my own. The horror of recognition sent a violent shudder through me, my body convulsing in panic. More faces emerged from the darkness, all the same, all identical versions of myself, rotted and forgotten. My mind could not grasp it, could not make sense of what I was seeing. The lighthouse had taken them all. The lighthouse had taken me. I fought, kicked, clawed at the water, but it pulled me deeper. The whispers returned, louder, furious. They spoke of endless nights, of solitude stretched beyond time, of a duty that never ended. The lighthouse did not just guide ships, it consumed its keepers. I felt the weight of it pressing into my skull, memories that were not mine, but were somehow buried within me. The past keepers, their fates sealed the moment they set foot on this cursed rock. No one ever left. The realization struck like ice in my veins. I was already part of it. My body jerked, twisted, a deep pressure crushing me from every angle. My vision blurred, my limbs stopped struggling, and then I was standing in the lighthouse again, dry, whole. The lantern flickered beside me, casting long, wavering shadows on the stone walls. My chest heaved, my skin clammy. Had it been a dream, a hallucination? I turned to the basement door. It was gone. No rotting wood, no water-stained floor, just smooth, untouched stone. But I knew better. The whispers had not stopped. They had simply grown quieter, more patient. The lighthouse hummed with something ancient, something endless. I was not free. I never had been. The months passed in a blur. My hands tended to the light. My feet moved along familiar paths. My lips spoke words I did not remember forming. The world outside felt distant, unreachable. My reflection in the lantern glass looked hollow, wrong. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I saw them still, waiting beneath the waves. The lighthouse would call again. Another keeper would come. And when they did, I knew what I had to do. Down in the basement, a new door had appeared, and behind it, the knocking had begun again. It's been years since that night, but I still see his face in my dreams. It's like a really scary mask stuck in my head. Even now, the salty wind sounds like he's screaming, which reminds me of the horror I saw at the lighthouse, the place on the edge of the world. It was like something out of a scary story, a nightmare I can't wake up from. I remember it like it was just yesterday, a nice fall day when the call came in about a missing lighthouse keeper, a man named Silas. He was in charge of the old North Point Lighthouse for more than 20 years. He was always there, a quiet man who seemed like he was part of the rocks on the beach. He was reliable, which meant he never missed work. He always kept the light working right. So when he didn't call in that morning, the Coast Guard sent us to find him. They were worried something bad happened. I was happy to go. I wanted to prove to them I was good. The boat ride there was easy. The sea was calm, and the sun was pale. But as we got closer to the island, I started feeling weird. The lighthouse stood tall and white against the gray sky, like it was watching over the ocean. But something was not right. It was too quiet, and it made me feel uncomfortable. Usually, you'd hear seagulls flying around and the waves crashing on the rocks. But that day, it was just silent, like everything was holding its breath, so it didn't make any noise. Even the wind stopped blowing so hard. It felt like it was scared. We got out of the boat and walked toward the lighthouse. The door was big and wooden, and it was open, which was strange, because Silas always locked it. He was very careful. As we walked inside, the air got heavy and cold. It was much different than outside. The inside of the lighthouse was dark. The only light came from some small windows. Dust was floating in the air, and it made the room look creepy. The air smelled like salt and old stones. We called out for Silas, but nobody answered. Our voices echoed in the silence, and it made me feel even more worried. The silence felt like it was pushing in on us, like we were trapped. We started looking around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It felt like something was watching us from the shadows. The rooms on the first floor were normal. There was a small kitchen, a living room, and a storage room. Silas kept everything tidy, but he wasn't there. We couldn't find any clue where he had gone. It was weird. We climbed the winding stairs to the light at the top of the lighthouse. Every step made a noise because it was so quiet. The stairs were old and worn, and the metal rail was cold when I touched it. As we climbed, the air got colder, and the silence got even worse. The higher we climbed, the more scared I felt. I had a strange feeling on the back of my neck, like something was breathing on me. I kept looking back, thinking something was in the shadows. It was so unsettling. When we finally got to the light room, it was both beautiful and scary. The big lens in the middle of the room was still turning, and its bright light was shining out across the ocean. It was like a beacon in the dark, but the room was empty. There was no Silas. There was no sign of what had happened. The only strange thing was a small stool that was turned over by the railing. I walked over to the railing and looked out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks, and their white foam was lit up by the light from the lighthouse. The wind was loud and smelled like salt and something else, something I couldn't describe, but it was bad, really bad. It was then that I saw something move quickly in the dark. It was a shadow dancing just outside the light. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks on me, or maybe a bird, but I still felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We kept looking around the light room, but we didn't find anything. No clues, no answers. As it started getting dark outside, we decided to go back down and look around the land near the lighthouse. I stayed for a moment longer, watching the light turn around and around. It was mesmerizing, like a dance. I watched it shine on the water. It was then that I noticed something strange in the reflection of the glass. In the shiny lens, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was a dark and blurry shape that seemed to move and twist in the light. My heart jumped into my throat, and I quickly turned around, but there was nobody there, just the empty room and the bright light. I told myself I must have imagined it, that the light was playing tricks on my eyes, or that I was just tired. But the image in the reflection stayed in my mind. It was a dark and scary presence that seemed to watch me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I stood there trying to figure out what I had seen, or thought I had seen, a cold feeling washed over me. The air in the light room seemed to get colder, and the silence became even heavier. I felt like eyes were staring into the back of my head. It was so strong that it made me shiver. I wanted to get out of there. I stepped back from the railing. Everything seemed darker, and every sound seemed louder. The light kept turning around, and it felt like it was making fun of me. I heard a faint whisper, a soft noise that seemed to come from nowhere. I couldn't tell where it came from. I tried to hear what it was saying, but I couldn't understand it. It was a strange sound, like something sliding through the air. I told myself it was just the wind or the old building making noises, but I knew it was something else, something bad. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. I turned back to the lens, drawn to the light, and that's when I saw him again, in the glass, Standing right behind me was a dark shape. I couldn't see his face. It was hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, his body twisted in a weird way, and his eyes were glowing with an evil light. He looked like a monster. I gasped and turned around quickly, but again, there was nobody there, just the empty room and the light from the lighthouse. But this time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. He was there. I could feel him. It felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I could smell him too, a terrible smell like burning flesh and something rotting. It made me want to throw up. I backed away slowly towards the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, to get away from this place of horror, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. I couldn't move. As I reached the top of the stairs, I felt hands on my back, cold and wet. They pushed me hard, and I stumbled towards the railing. I screamed as I lost my balance, waving my arms trying to catch myself, but it was no use. I was going to fall. I was falling towards the railing, the hard metal edge getting closer. As I fell, I saw his face. He was standing behind me, his face twisted into a mask of horror. His skin was burned and scarred. His eyes were wide with anger, and his mouth was open, but he wasn't making any sound. It was like a silent scream. It was Silas, but not the Silas I knew. His face was ruined by fire and hate. It was a face that would haunt me forever. A face that was the very definition of evil. A face that would never let me sleep peacefully again. I hit the railing with a loud thud. The air was knocked out of me, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Everything went blurry. I grabbed the railing, trying to pull myself up, but my arms were weak and shaking. I couldn't hold on. As I struggled, I saw him again, standing over me. His burned face was inches from mine, his eyes full of joy at my pain, and his silent scream filled my head. I knew then that he was going to kill me, that I was going to die in this terrible place. I was trapped. He raised his hands above his head, his fingers twisted like dead branches, and he brought them down on me with all his strength. I felt a burning pain in my head, and then I couldn't see anything. Everything went black. I was gone. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the light room. My head was throbbing, and my body ached all over. The lighthouse light was still turning, casting spooky shadows around the room. The light seemed to mock me. I stood up, feeling dizzy. The room was empty. There was no sign of Silas, and no sign of what had happened. I thought maybe I had imagined everything, that the stress and tiredness had made me see things. But when I looked at my hands, they were covered in blood from the cut on my head. I knew then that it wasn't a dream. It was all real. I went down the stairs, my legs weak and shaky. My friends were looking for me outside. They ran to me when they saw me. They were shocked to see my face pale and my clothes covered in blood. I told them what happened, what I had seen in the light room, but they didn't believe me. They said I was confused, that I had hit my head and imagined everything. They looked all over the lighthouse, but they didn't find Silas, and they didn't see any sign of a fight. They decided that Silas had just disappeared, vanished into thin air. They took me back to the mainland. I got medical help, and I talked to a doctor, but nobody believed my story. They said I was suffering from trauma, that my mind was making things up to deal with the stress. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen in the light room. I knew that Silas wasn't just missing, that he was dead, and that his ghost was trapped in the lighthouse, filled with rage and hate. His spirit was forever bound to the place. The lighthouse was closed after that, because it was too dangerous. It stands there to this day, a silent watcher on the edge of the world. And sometimes, when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear his silent scream. It's a chilling reminder of the horror I saw on that terrible night, a night that changed my life forever, a night I'll never forget.